year 897 AD, something extraordinary happened in Rome. A dead pope was put on trial. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. A corpse that had been buried for 9 months was dug up, dressed in papal vestments, carried into a church council, formally accused of crimes, defended by a lawyer, convicted, and then thrown into a river. This is not a story from some dark fantasy or political satire. This actually happened. The historical record is clear, if frustratingly incomplete, and the event has gone down in history by a name that sounds almost fictional: the Cadaver Synod. To understand how this could possibly have happened, you have to understand the world of late 9th century Rome. Because 897 AD was not a normal time in the history of the papacy. It was a period of extraordinary political chaos, a time when the office of the Pope had become entangled in a web of violent family rivalries, foreign political interference, and naked ambition. The papacy was not merely a spiritual office, it was also a significant political entity, controlling territory, commanding resources, and wielding enormous influence over the politics of central Italy. And that made the papal throne a prize worth fighting for, sometimes literally fighting for, with armies and violence. Pope Formosus became pope in 891 AD, and his path to the throne was itself a reflection of the messy politics of the era. He had served as Bishop of Porto and had earlier been a papal legate to the court of Arnulf of Carinthia, who was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe at the time. When Pope Nicholas I died, the succession was disputed, and Formosus found himself at the center of a complicated political struggle. He had allies among the Germanic rulers to the north, and when the dust settled after considerable maneuvering, Formosus had emerged as the new pope. But his election had been controversial. The Spoleto faction, which had backed previous popes, was not happy about Formosus's coronation. The local Roman nobility resented what they saw as foreign influence in papal elections, and there were persistent questions about whether Formosus had obtained the papacy through proper canonical means or through political scheming and the weight of Arnulf's support. These questions would follow him throughout his pontificate and would ultimately be raised against him after his death. Formosus himself was, by most contemporary accounts, a reasonably competent administrator. He handled diplomatic relations with the Holy Roman Empire. He managed the usual ecclesiastical business of the Church. He dealt with the administrative challenges of papal governance. He was not particularly beloved, but then popes did not necessarily need to be beloved. They needed to be effective, and Formosus was at least functional, if not spectacular. But competence is not always enough to protect a political leader, especially when there are powerful people who very much want them gone. When Formosus died on November 23, 896 AD, he was buried with honor in St. Peter's Basilica. And that should have been the end of the story. A pope died, was interred with appropriate ceremony, and the Church moved on to choose his successor. That is how it was supposed to work. That is how it had always worked. But in 897 AD, the succession did not work the way it was supposed to. What followed Formosus's death was a period of extraordinary instability that would make modern political observers weep with frustration. His immediate successor, Pope John IX, was killed within less than a year in what appears to have been a politically motivated assassination. Then Theodore II took over, but he lasted only 20 days before dying of what may have been natural causes, which in that environment was almost remarkable in its mundanity. Then came John X, who was arrested, imprisoned, and reportedly strangled in his cell. The papal throne had become so dangerous that simply occupying it was a mortal risk. By any reasonable measure, the office of pope had become nearly impossible to hold. And then, in May of 897 AD, Pope Stephen VI came to power. Stephen VI was a man with a theory. Looking at the chaos of the previous decade, at the violence and instability that had plagued the papacy, he concluded that all of it could be traced back to one source: Pope Formosus. Stephen believed that Formosus had obtained the papacy through fraud, that he had violated multiple church laws in the process, and that his entire pontificate was therefore illegitimate. Every subsequent crisis, every act of violence, every problem the church had faced since Formosus's death was, in Stephen's interpretation, divine punishment for allowing an unworthy man to occupy St. Peter's throne. There was just one complication with this theory. Formosus was dead. He had been dead for 9 months. He was already in the ground, already beyond any earthly judgment, already answering to a higher authority than any church council. He could not defend himself. He could not respond to accusations. He could not produce witnesses in his own behalf. He was, by any reasonable definition, beyond the reach of human justice. But Stephen VI was not a man who let practicalities stand in the way of a good theory, and that is when he made the decision that has made him infamous for more than 1,000 years. He would exhume Formosus. He would put the dead pope on trial, and he would formally condemn the man who had been dead for 3/4 of a year. The Cadaver Synod was about to begin. In January of 897 AD, Pope Stephen VI gave an order that no pope had ever given before, and that no pope has given since. He commanded that the body of Pope Formosus be exhumed from St. Peter's Basilica and brought before a church council to face charges related to his pontificate. Think about what this means. In the year 897 AD, in a world without modern forensic science, without any understanding of how bodies decompose over time, without the ability to preserve remains in any meaningful way, Stephen VI looked at a 9-month-old grave and decided that this was a perfectly reasonable course of action. He was going to dig up his predecessor and put him on trial. The exhumation was carried out, and what they found would have tested the nerves of even the most devoted supporter of Stephen VI's enterprise. The body of Formosus was 9 months old. After that length of time in the ground, particularly in the climate of Rome, the flesh would have been in a significant state of decomposition. The features would have been largely unrecognizable. This was not a peaceful sleeping figure in a crypt, serene and intact. This was a corpse in the active and not particularly dignified stages of biological decay. But Stephen VI was undeterred by biology. He was a man with a mission, and he was not going to let the ordinary processes of decomposition stand in his way. He ordered the corpse dressed in full papal vestments. This was a crucial symbolic decision. Formosus was not being tried as a former pope, as someone whose career was finished and whose record was being reviewed. He was being tried as if he were still the pope, as if death had no meaning, as if the office he had held was still his to occupy and to lose. The vestments represented the authority of the papacy, and by dressing the corpse in them, Stephen was making a statement about what he believed that authority truly was, and whether Formosus had ever legitimately held it. So they put the mitre on the decaying head, they draped the papal robes across the rotting shoulders, they placed an orb in what remained of the hands that had once held the symbols of papal power. And when the dressing was complete, they had created one of the most bizarre and disturbing images in all of recorded history. A 9-month-old corpse, recognizable only with difficulty, dressed in the full regalia of the papacy, propped up, arranged, made as presentable as circumstances would allow, as if it was still the living occupant of St. Peter's throne. The procession that followed through the streets of Rome must have been an extraordinary sight. The body of Formosus was carried from wherever it had been interred across the city to the Lateran Basilica, which was the traditional seat of papal authority and the location of major church councils. This was not a quiet funeral procession conducted in accordance with established tradition. This was a public spectacle, a demonstration of power, a theatrical production staged for the benefit of anyone who might still harbor sympathy for the dead pope or doubt the legitimacy of the current occupant of the throne. The citizens of Rome who witnessed this grotesque parade passing through their streets would have known immediately that something unprecedented was happening. A dead man in papal costume being transported to face judgment for crimes allegedly committed while alive was not something you could easily explain away or pretend was normal. When they arrived at the Lateran Basilica, the corpse was placed in the papal throne, seated, positioned, given the place of honor at the head of the council chamber, as if Formosus were about to preside over the proceedings rather than stand as the accused. This was the ultimate irony of the trial. The man being tried for allegedly illegitimately holding papal power was being given all the trappings of that power for the purposes of his trial, as if the court needed him to look like a pope in order to properly condemn him for having been one. The council had been assembled for this occasion. Bishops and abbots and senior church officials gathered to witness what was either a profound act of ecclesiastical justice or an act of spectacular personal vindictiveness on the part of Stephen VI. The line between those two possibilities would have been visible to contemporary observers, and it is visible to us as well with the benefit of historical distance. Stephen VI presided. He had summoned this council. He had ordered the exhumation. He had orchestrated the entire production from beginning to end, and now he was ready to see it through to its conclusion. The charges were read aloud in the formal language of canon law, and they were serious charges, the kind that could destroy a man's legacy and, in the thinking of the time, damn his eternal soul. Formosus was accused of having obtained the papacy through fraud. Specifically, he was accused of having engaged in simony, which was the buying and selling of ecclesiastical office, using his political connections to Arnulf of Carinthia to secure his election, rather than allowing the canonical process to function properly. This was a serious crime in church law, potentially grounds for deposition and eternal condemnation. He was also accused of holding multiple bishoprics simultaneously, which was technically forbidden by church law without explicit papal dispensation, and he had reportedly never obtained that dispensation. This charge related to the fact that Formosus had retained his previous bishopric when he became pope, which his accusers argued was illegal and improper. And beyond these specific charges, there was the general accusation that he had been an unworthy pope, that his conduct throughout his pontificate had been improper, that he had brought dishonor to the office he occupied through his actions and his alliances. These were not frivolous accusations in the legal framework of the time. The Church had rules about how popes were elected, about the qualifications required for the office, about the proper conduct of the papacy. If those rules had been broken, the Church had a legitimate interest in addressing it, in formally establishing the truth about what had happened and what the consequences should be. The problem was the method Stephen VI had chosen to address it, because no matter how serious the charges, there is a fundamental problem with putting a corpse on trial. The problem is that a corpse cannot respond. A corpse cannot deny the charges. A corpse cannot produce witnesses in its defense. A corpse cannot cross-examine the witnesses against it. A corpse cannot do any of the things that a defendant is normally entitled to do in any court that pretends to the minimum standards of fairness. And yet, Stephen VI insisted on going forward anyway. The trial would proceed, the verdict would be delivered, and the corpse of Pope Formosus would be convicted of crimes that he was entirely incapable of responding to. Here is where the story becomes legally fascinating, because Stephen VI, in a twist that is either remarkable for its commitment to fairness or absurd for its futility, appointed a lawyer to defend the corpse. Medieval canon law had a genuine principle that even the dead were entitled to defense. This was not Stephen VI suddenly developing a sense of fairness or compassion. This was simply how canon law worked, a reflection of the Church's broader commitment to due process, even in cases where the defendant was clearly beyond caring about the outcome. The forms of justice mattered, even when justice itself was impossible to achieve. And so a defense lawyer was assigned to speak on behalf of Pope Formosus, a man who had been dead for 9 months and who was currently rotting in papal vestments on a throne in the Lateran Basilica, while a council prepared to convict him of crimes he could not possibly have committed or defended himself against. Imagine being that lawyer. Your client cannot give you instructions. Your client cannot meet with you to discuss strategy. Your client cannot testify on their own behalf. Your client cannot be present in any meaningful way in the proceedings. Your client is, by any reasonable biological definition, no longer a participant in these proceedings in any way that matters. And yet, you have been assigned to somehow salvage the reputation and, in the religious context, the eternal soul of a corpse. What do you even say? What possible defense can there be for a man who cannot speak, who cannot respond, who cannot challenge his accusers, who cannot do anything at all except sit there, decaying in his vestments while the charges are read? The defense argument, as best we can reconstruct it from the historical record, was essentially this: the dead are beyond the jurisdiction of earthly courts. This was not some desperate improvisation dreamed up by a lawyer trying to salvage an impossible case. This was a genuine and well-established principle in Roman law, which was the foundation of much medieval legal thinking. The dead are at peace. They have passed beyond the reach of human justice. You cannot try a man who has already been judged by a higher authority. You cannot convict a man who can no longer be punished in any way that matters to him. The earthly court has no jurisdiction over the dead. The defense was essentially arguing that the entire premise of the trial was fundamentally wrong. The dead cannot be tried because the dead are not legal persons capable of standing trial. Whatever Formosus did or did not do in his life, whatever crimes he may or may not have committed, the proper forum for judging him was not a church council in January of 897 AD. The proper forum was the divine judgment that every Christian believed awaited all souls after death, a judgment that Formosus had presumably already faced, or was in the process of facing. It is, when you think about it, a remarkably sophisticated legal argument. The defense lawyer was not trying to prove Formosus innocent of the specific charges. He was questioning the basic authority of the court to hear the case at all. He was raising a jurisdictional objection, a principle that would be recognized in virtually any modern legal system as a complete and total defense. If the court has no jurisdiction, then the trial cannot proceed, and nothing else matters. Stephen VI was not persuaded. This is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the entire episode. The defense raised a fundamental jurisdictional objection, a principle that would be recognized in virtually any modern court as a complete defense, and Stephen VI simply ignored it. He pressed forward. The council was not going to let a little thing like the fundamental nature of legal jurisdiction and due process get in the way of a predetermined outcome. The charges were read again in detail. Formosus had obtained the papacy through political scheming, through the manipulation of elections, through the influence of Arnulf of Carinthia, rather than through the proper canonical process. This was simony, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical office, and it was a serious crime in church law. Formosus had held multiple bishoprics simultaneously, which was forbidden without explicit papal dispensation, and he had reportedly never obtained that dispensation. He had thus violated the basic rules governing ecclesiastical appointments. And beyond these specific charges, there was the general accusation that he had been an unworthy pope, that his conduct had been improper, that he had brought dishonor to the office he held through his actions. These were the crimes for which a dead man was being tried. These were the accusations read aloud in the Lateran basilica to an empty corpse that could not possibly respond to any of them. The defense sat there, unable to do much more than repeat its jurisdictional objection and hope that somewhere in the council there was someone with the courage to agree with it. Stephen VI, as presiding authority, was unmoved by the defense argument. He had made his decision. The principle that the dead cannot be tried was rejected, or at least set aside, in favor of what Stephen clearly believed was a higher justice. If Formosus had truly corrupted the church, if his pontificate was truly illegitimate, if the chaos of the past decade was truly divine punishment for allowing an unworthy man to hold the papacy, then that stain needed to be formally addressed, even if the man himself was beyond any earthly punishment. The verdict would still matter. The verdict would establish the truth as Stephen understood it. The verdict would clear the air and allow the church to move forward unburdened by the ghost of a fraudulent pope. The council deliberated, such as that deliberation was, and then the verdict was delivered. Guilty. Pope Formosus, the corpse seated in the papal throne, was found guilty on all counts. The charges of fraud were upheld. The charges of plurality of bishoprics were upheld. The general accusation of unworthiness as a pontiff was upheld. The council had spoken, and the verdict was clear. Whatever the defense had argued, whatever the jurisdictional objections might have been, the outcome had been predetermined from the moment Stephen VI had ordered the exhumation. The Cadaver Synod had achieved its purpose. The sentence that followed was swift and brutal, and designed to send a message that would resonate through the history of the Church. First came the defrocking. Even though Formosus was already dead, even though he had been stripped of his mortal life 9 months earlier and was now beyond any human punishment that could actually affect him, Stephen VI ordered that the dead pope be stripped of his papal honors as well. The vestments that had been so carefully placed on the decaying body in preparation for the trial were now removed, one by one. The mitre was taken from the head. The robes were pulled from the shoulders. The orb was taken from whatever remained of the hands that had once held the symbols of papal power. This was not merely a symbolic act of little practical consequence. In the theological thinking of the time, papal vestments carried genuine spiritual significance. They were not merely ceremonial clothing. They were outward signs of an inward grace, markers of a sacred office that carried real spiritual authority. Removing them from a corpse was meant to be a profound statement about the man's true nature, a declaration that he had never truly been worthy of the office he had held, that all his acts as pope had been somehow vitiated by his fundamental unfitness for the role. And then came something even more disturbing and grisly than the stripping of the vestments. The fingers of Formosus' right hand were broken. Not all the fingers, but specifically the fingers of the right hand, the hand that in papal tradition had administered the sacraments, that had blessed the faithful, that had performed the sacred rites of the Church. Breaking those specific fingers was meant to be a kind of spiritual nullification, a way of declaring that this man had never legitimately performed any of those sacred duties. His blessings were void. His sacraments were invalid. His entire pontificate was, in the eyes of Stephen VI and this council, as if it had never happened. The acts he had performed were retroactively erased, his spiritual authority dissolved, his legacy destroyed in the most literal way possible. This was not just a legal verdict. This was an attempt to go back in time and literally erase a man's entire contribution to church history, to pretend that he had never held the office at all, that everything he had done as pope had been null and void from the beginning. In Stephen VI's mind, this was justice. This was setting the record straight. This was cleaning up the mess that Formosus had left behind. And then came the final sentence, the one that would give the event its enduring name and its place in the annals of legal absurdity. Pope Stephen VI ordered that the body of Pope Formosus be thrown into the Tiber River. Not buried again with honor, not returned to St. Peter's for a proper Christian interment, not treated with any of the basic respect that was traditionally accorded to the dead, especially to dead popes. Just discarded, thrown into the river like refuse, like something unworthy of holy ground, like something that did not deserve to be associated any longer with the sacred space of the basilica where he had been buried. No funeral rites were to be performed for Formosus. No blessing was to be given. The body that had once been the vicar of Christ, the representative of God on earth, the spiritual leader of all Christendom, was now to be nothing more than garbage carried away by the dark current of Rome's central river. The sentence was a statement not just about Formosus, but about what Stephen VI believed the papacy itself should be and should never have been. The execution of this sentence would have been a grim spectacle. The body, now thoroughly defrocked and reduced to a naked corpse, was carried through the streets of Rome. These were the same streets it had passed through just days earlier on its way to the trial, now retracing that route in reverse, but heading not to a throne in the Lateran, but to the muddy banks of the Tiber. The citizens of Rome who watched this second grotesque parade would have seen a very different body than the one they had seen before. Then it had been dressed in papal finery, arranged respectfully, given the appearance of honor. Now it was naked and broken and discarded, heading for the river. At the banks of the Tiber, the body was thrown into the water. There was no ceremony. There were no final words. There was nothing except a corpse sliding into the dark current, sinking or floating as physics and the river decided, and then gone, carried downstream, away from the city, away from the basilica, away from any hope of the Christian burial that every medieval Christian believed their soul needed in order to find peace in the afterlife. The Cadaver Synod was over. The verdict had been delivered. The sentence had been carried out. Stephen VI had gotten his justice, whatever that word means in this context. A dead pope had been tried, convicted, defrocked, and thrown into a river. In the history of law, of religion, of human civilization, there is nothing else quite like it. And the body of Pope Formosus floated in the Tiber, beyond the reach of any court, beyond the reach of any justice, beyond the reach of anything at all except the river and whatever awaited in the world beyond. 15 days after the trial, Pope Stephen VI was dead. The historical record is frustratingly vague on the exact cause. Some sources suggest natural causes, the inevitable result of the stress and tension of a reign spent dealing with political enemies and church politics. Some sources hint at something more sinister, the possibility that Stephen's many enemies in Rome took matters into their own hands once the spectacle of the trial was over. And some sources simply note the timing without comment, leaving us to draw our own conclusions. What we know is that within a fortnight of orchestrating the most extraordinary and infamous trial in the entire history of the papacy, Stephen VI himself was dead, and the papal throne passed to someone who had a very different view of what had just happened. Whether Stephen died of natural causes, was murdered by his enemies, or was the victim of some other circumstance entirely, the timing is too remarkable to ignore. The man who had exhumed his predecessor, had him tried and convicted and thrown into the Tiber, was himself dead before the month was out. Pope Theodore II took over, and his first act was to reverse the verdict entirely. He declared Formosus innocent of all charges. He ordered the body recovered from the Tiber and returned to St. Peter's Basilica for a proper burial with full honours. He annulled the proceedings of the Cadaver Synod as illegitimate and unjust. He reinstated Formosus as a legitimately elected pope, restoring him to the official records of the Church as someone who had been wrongly condemned. And, in a remarkable historical reversal, everything Stephen VI had accomplished was undone in a matter of days. The trial that was supposed to set the record straight instead created a mess that Theodore II had to spend considerable effort cleaning up. The posthumous rehabilitation of Formosus was more complete than anyone could have predicted when the body was thrown into the river. Within 2 weeks, the condemned pope was honoured again, his legacy restored, his reputation cleared. Stephen's victory turned out to be entirely ephemeral. The recovery of the body from the river was apparently successful. Formosus was pulled from the Tiber, and despite everything he had been through, the sources suggest he was identified by certain distinctive physical characteristics that had survived the rough treatment of the previous weeks. He was cleaned, prepared, and returned to the basilica where he had originally been buried. Full funeral rites were performed. The honours that had been stripped were restored, and Pope Formosus, posthumously rehabilitated, was once again recognized as a legitimately elected pope of the Roman Catholic Church. His condemnation erased from the official record as if it had never happened. The Church also made a new rule in response to this episode. Henceforth, No corpse could be put on trial in an ecclesiastical court. The dead were exempt from prosecution. The living could be judged, could be condemned, could have their legacies challenged through official church proceedings, but once someone had passed beyond mortal existence, they were beyond the reach of church discipline. This rule was a direct response to the Cadaver Synod, a recognition that something had gone terribly wrong in those proceedings, and a determination to ensure it could never happen again. The Church was not going to put itself in the position of trying to administer justice to someone who could no longer participate in the process. So what are we to make of all this more than 1,000 years later? The Cadaver Synod is often cited as an example of legal absurdity, and that is certainly one way to look at it. Putting a corpse on trial, assigning it a lawyer, delivering a verdict against someone who cannot possibly be affected by the outcome, is the kind of thing that seems to belong in a satire or a dark comedy rather than in the serious annals of legal history. It is genuinely hard to take seriously as a genuine legal proceeding. When we read the historical accounts, it is difficult not to see it as a farce, a grotesque piece of theatre performed in the name of justice. But there is something deeper here about the nature of law and justice and the boundaries of legal authority that makes it worth taking seriously as more than just a strange historical curiosity. The question that the defense raised, the question of whether the dead can be tried, is not as absurd as it might first appear. Modern law still grapples with questions about the legal status of the dead. Can you defame someone who is no longer alive? Can you steal from the dead? Can you violate the rights of the dead in ways that the law should recognize and address? These are real questions in modern legal systems around the world, and they do not have simple or universally agreed upon answers. In some ways, the medieval church was dealing with a version of a question that we still have not fully answered. When someone dies, what is it about them that remains subject to law? Their estate, certainly. Their wishes expressed in wills, absolutely. But beyond property and contracts, is there something about a person's legacy or memory that deserves legal protection? Can the dead be harmed in ways that the law should recognize and compensate? And conversely, is there something about a person's misdeeds that should follow them beyond the grave, that should be formally condemned even after their death, their reputation adjusted in the historical record? Stephen VI believed the answer to that last question was yes. He believed that a fraudulent pope could not be allowed to rest peacefully while his fraud remained unaddressed. He believed that the truth mattered more than the convenience of letting the dead simply disappear into the ground and out of human memory. In his mind, he was doing the right thing, pursuing genuine justice for what he saw as a serious wrong committed against the Church and against God. And yet, the outcome was chaos. The trial was reversed within weeks. The body was recovered and reburied. The entire proceedings were declared illegitimate, and the Church had to make a new rule specifically to prevent this from happening again. Whatever justice Stephen VI thought he was achieving, whatever sense of closure or resolution he believed the trial had provided, the practical effect was to create a constitutional mess that his successor had to spend considerable effort cleaning up. The Cadaver Synod was an administrative disaster as well as a legal and moral one. The event stands as a monument to the dangers of letting legal procedure run away with common sense. It shows what happens when you apply the forms of justice without any of the essential elements that make justice meaningful. A trial requires a defendant who can respond to the charges. It requires evidence that can be tested and challenged. It requires a judge who is genuinely open to being persuaded by the arguments on both sides. None of those elements were present in the Lateran Basilica in 897 AD. What was present was a predetermined verdict in search of a procedure to legitimize it. And that is always dangerous in any legal system, no matter what era it operates in. In the end, Pope Formosus was pulled from the Tiber, reburied in St. Peter's, and officially declared innocent. Pope Stephen VI was dead within a fortnight of his great legal triumph. The Church made a rule that the dead could never be tried again, and the world was left with one of the strangest stories in the entire history of law. A reminder that human beings have always been capable of extraordinary foolishness in the name of justice. The case was closed. Until next time. Production notes. Target duration 50 minutes total. 5 chunks times 10 minutes each at 130 word per mimma. Target word count 6,500 words, around 1,300 per chunk.
Character limit per chunk, under 9,000 characters. Voice, 11 Labs Voice ID UMQN 7J S1EE8B1CZSUTQH. Same as EP001/EP002. Style, direct narration, B-roll driven, no on-screen presenter. Tone, educational, slightly dark humor, legal history angle. Sensitivity, focus on legal absurdity and institutional politics, not religious mockery. B-roll suggestions, medieval Rome illustrations and period maps, Vatican and Lateran basilica imagery, historical manuscripts and church documents from the period, Tiber River footage and imagery, law books and legal history references, medieval church council depictions and artistic reconstructions, St. Peter's Basilica imagery, key narrative beats for visual editing. Chunk 1 ends on "The Cadaver Synod was about to begin." Chunk 2 ends on "Stephen VI insisted on going forward anyway." Chunk 3 ends on "Guilty." Chunk 4 ends with the body in the river. Chunk 5 ends with "The case was closed. Until next time." Script status: ready for voiceover.